Mediatizing a Pandemic, Understanding the Role of Media in the COVID-19 Crisis. Professor Hallen is well known for his books comparing media systems beyond the Western world, The Uncensored War, the Media and Vietnam, We Keep America on Top of the World, and most recently his book with Professor Charles Briggs of University of California, Berkeley, Making Health Public. And I'm sure through this talk over the next 45 minutes or so, we are going to be very intrigued with the various facets that Professor Hallen brings out in his talk. To our audience, I would just like to tell you that we will have a Q&A with Professor soon after his talk. So please keep your questions coming on the chat window, and I will direct them to Professor as and when we start the Q&A after his talk. And with that, I hand it over to you, Professor Hallen. Again, it's an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the IIM Bangalore's talk series on health communication. And this is the first in the series that we are starting off on a very important and critical topic. So thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this. And I hand it over to you from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ganapathy. Welcome to everyone in India and across the world. Let me share my screen and see if I can put my PowerPoint up. Okay, I hope that's working. So I'd like to begin by summarizing some of the conceptual framework of the book Making Health Public, and talk a little bit about my approach to health communication. I come from the fields of political communication and journalism studies, and I was a newcomer to the field of health communication when I began working on this book. When I started reading the literature on health communication, one thing that struck me as interesting and also very problematic was a common assumption, a common model of how health communication worked that saw it as a linear downward flow of information from scientists to the lay public. So the function of health news and health journalism in this model was to transmit health knowledge downward from scientists who produced it to lay people who lacked it and needed to be educated. And so it was a passive role that the journalists were assigned in this process. In our book, we call this the linear transmission model, this view of a top-down straight line flow of information from science to the mass public. It implies that the role of journalism is essentially passive, and also journalism is often seen from this point of view as a potential source of distortion. And one of the arguments of our book is to criticize this point of view. This point of view often goes along with what's known as the two cultures trope, which has a long history in the study of health journalism, which sees science and journalism as two opposed cultures. And it's seen in a very kind of hierarchical way in which science is understood as objective, evidence-based, complex, autonomous, while journalism is seen as essentially driven by commercial motives and personalistic, sensationalistic, anecdotal, simplistic, and heteronymous, not autonomous in the way that science is. In our book, we argue that the linear transmission view is simplistic, and as we will see, the case of pandemic communication illustrates this very strongly. The field of science studies has shown us that science isn't a fixed body of knowledge waiting to be transmitted. It's a process. It involves debate and trial and error, and different specializations have different points of view. And when we turn to health and medicine, they are social fields in which science plays a central role, certainly, but it is hardly the only thing that is going on. Healthcare and pharma industries are businesses and a big part of the economy. A lot of health and medical news actually appears in the business section of the newspaper. Health and medicine are also an area that is heavily regulated and funded by the government. and is something quite political in this sense. And health is also deeply a part of what philosopher Jürgen Habermas calls the life world, in which human individuals live, die, raise their children, make choices, and give their lives meaning. It involves a lot of different kinds of actors, different interests, different values and forms of knowledge. And journalists in producing health news inevitably play an active role in mediating among these different actors and perspectives. Obviously, this suggests that the two cultures trope is much too simplistic when you consider the complexity of both these cultures. One of the points that I have stressed in my work is that journalism and science are in some ways more similar than different in their commitment to certain key values, including evidence-based knowledge production and also professional autonomy. I was struck as I followed health news closely at how often journalists played the role of defending evidence-based medicine against forces that would undermine it, pharmaceutical marketing, for example, or to connect it to the current pandemic, defending against political intervention into the operation of the Centers for Disease Control. Another element in the conceptual framework of making health public that I will refer to in discussing pandemic news has to do with the concepts of mediatization and biomedicalization. Mediatization is a common theory in the field of communication that holds that media institutions and media logics have come increasingly to shape other institutions and practices in society. Stig Harvard, one of the main theorists, defines it in this way. He says, the media acquire greater autonomy to define social reality and condition patterns of interaction. Media have become an integral part of other institutions' operations, while also achieving a degree of self-determination and autonomy, which forces other institutions to submit to their logic. In my own field of political communication, there's a large body of research on the ways in which media logics have transformed politics, shifting us from a world of backroom negotiations among political professionals to a world of political marketing and image making through the mass media, as manifested, of course, in the fact that during the pandemic in the United States, we had a reality TV star as president, one who relied more on information he gets from cable news and social media than on experts in government who traditionally have produced the information and analysis on which public policy was based. And this was true, by the way, of the pandemic, that Trump trusted much more in what he saw on Fox News than he did in the biomedical experts in the Centers for Disease Control. Mediatization is a broad process of social change that affects life in general, and certainly health and medicine are affected as well. Here's just one example. This was an article that appeared in the New York Times some years ago. I'll read a few paragraphs of it. It says, the American Cancer Society, which has long been a staunch defender of most cancer screening, is now saying that the benefits of detecting many cancers, especially breast and prostate, have been overstated. It is quietly working on a message to put on its website early next year to emphasize that screening for breast and prostate cancer and certain other cancers can come with a real risk of overtreating many small cancers while missing cancers that are deadly. We don't want people to panic, said Dr. Otis Brawley, the chief medical officer of the Cancer Society. But I'm admitting that American medicine has overpromised when it comes to screening. The advantages to screening have been exaggerated. This article produced a huge reaction with fierce debates on social media and long stories on the network news today. And this obviously is an irony, given that the article says that the Cancer Society was quietly working on a message to announce to the mass public. It apparently resulted from a comment that the head of the American Cancer Society made to a New York Times reporter at a cocktail party. And it's a classic example of mediatization. So the biomedical insiders were trying to follow old rules, discussing quietly among themselves, and then at the time of their choosing, transmitting their recommendations to lay people. Instead, they were forced to play by the rules of a media-saturated society. At the same time, as I read the literature in the sociology and anthropology of medicine, there was another theory about social change that is interestingly parallel to the mediatization literature, which sees biomedicine as increasingly shaping and penetrating other spheres of society and culture. And one classic article defines it this way. They define biomedicalization as the process through which aspects of life previously outside the jurisdiction of medicine come to be construed as medical problems. The extension of medical jurisdiction over health itself, in addition to illness, disease, and injury, and the commodification of health. Biomedicine has become a potent lens through which we culturally interpret, understand, and seek to transform bodies and lives. This argument also seems to have much truth to it. Increasingly, if children don't do it well in school, we see this as a medical problem. If we are unhappy with our sex life, this is a medical problem. What we eat and what we do in our leisure time are guided by biomedical science. And we turn to biomedicine to tell us our ethnic identity and family connections. So how are we to understand these two processes, mediatization and biomedicalization, in relation to one another? On the surface, it seems like they can't both be true. Either media are colonizing medicine or the other way around. They can't be both happening at once. In fact, in the book, we try to show that they are both happening at once. And we develop analysis of the co-production of health news and more generally of public knowledge about health and medicine by journalists, public relations people, and many other actors. We try to show that mediatization and biomedicalization are in fact interrelated, and you can't really understand one without understanding the other. And we argue that if biomedicine is extending its reach into more and more areas of life and culture, this happens to a large extent through mediatization, as media carry the influence of biomedicine into other spheres of society and culture. Now, in this book, we develop a number of examples of this kind of combined process of co-production, and one of them focuses on epidemics, specifically on the swine flu or H1N1 pandemic in 2009. So let's turn to pandemics, and I'll start out with the example of swine flu and move increasingly into COVID. I'll focus especially on the US case, but emphasizing elements that many of which are universal, and others of which I think are common to many countries. And I'll also report some results from a study of 37 countries in their COVID coverage. On the surface, a pandemic might seem like an occasion when the linear transmission model of health communication actually does apply, or at least when it should apply. A pandemic is an emergency that involves a threat to everyone in society. And there is a strong assumption that during a pandemic, we need to trust in authorities, particularly in this case, scientific authorities, and follow the recommendations they are making to protect us from a threat that they know better than we. The role of the media during a pandemic has often been seen negatively, both in popular culture, I would say, and in a lot of research scholarship, in line with the two cultures model. So the media are typically accused of hyping a public health crisis, sensationalizing it, and generating irrational alarm. But our research on the H1N1 pandemic, and similar to a lot of other research on the role of the media in that pandemic, suggests that this isn't necessarily true, and certainly wasn't true of that pandemic. In that case, the news media followed very closely the messaging of public health officials. And if there was a tone of alarm at first, this was a deliberate effort by public health authorities to get the attention of the public. Richard Besser, who was at the time the interim director of the Centers for Disease Control in the US, told us, you only have one chance to get ahead of a new outbreak. You have to hit it hard, hit it early, and then you can back off. So officials themselves generated this, this sense of alarm, but they balanced this with an effort to avoid panic by assuring people that they were well prepared to meet the threat, that they had the virus under close and careful watch, as Margaret Chan, the director of the World Health Organization, put it, and that the nation had the technology and infrastructure to handle a pandemic. Besser himself, appearing against a soothing blue background almost every day and projecting calm, confident expertise, helped enormously to create the impression of a situation under control. And the journalists very clearly echoed this balanced message. In general, during the H1N1 pandemic, public health officials maintained strong control over the flow of information. They dominated the news coverage and were portrayed in a highly positive way. And politicians mostly stepped aside and played a supporting role. I'll have more to say about this in a moment. Counter messages also, conspiracy theories and efforts to minimize or to politicize the pandemic remained marginal. A pandemic is often a situation in which biomedicalization is particularly strong, when the authority of biomedicine is enhanced, and we look to biomedicine for advice about how to protect ourselves in a suddenly dangerous world. And in many ways, this became even stronger during the COVID pandemic, as we all waited for biomedicine to tell us how we could go safely about our daily lives. I remember reading an article in the sports section of the newspaper about a year ago, in which two epidemiologists were quoted, and thinking, yes, biomedicalization is really going on now, with epidemiologists quoted in sports stories. So in this way, the linear transmission of top-down communication from biomedical professionals through journalists to the mass public seems right. But if we look more closely, what is going on in a pandemic is more complicated. For one thing, I would say that journalists worked in harmony with public officials, but they were active in their own ways. I remember an incident, for example, when Don McNeil, who was the reporter for the New York Times, decided to do a big story explaining why officials didn't believe that it made sense to close the US-Mexican border. And in general, he was making the argument that with flu, you can't, it just crosses borders. It's like the wind, right? It doesn't know any borders and it doesn't make any sense. And of course, he was reflecting scientific consensus, but I think that he was really a key actor here and played an important role in shutting down what was a growing discourse of closing the borders. So one problem with the linear transmission model is it ignores this much more active role of the journalist in the co-production of information about the pandemic. Another problem with the linear transmission view is that this view assumes that knowledge is created first in the realm of science and then later transmitted to the mass public through the media. But modern pandemics almost always involve emerging diseases. Obviously, this is true of the COVID pandemic. When the pandemic begins, scientists and public health officials remain uncertain about many fundamental questions. One of the most important examples was the question of asymptomatic transmission. There were major debates among health authorities about whether to assume that the virus could be transmitted by people without symptoms. And these were fundamental to the kinds of mitigation measures the authorities would recommend and the kinds of advice they would give to the public. Who should wear masks in what situation? Who should be tested? What kinds of social gatherings should be allowed? And this, of course, resulted in shifting recommendations that often challenged the credibility of biomedical authorities. Many other questions remain uncertain even today, in part because the virus itself continues to evolve. How long are people contagious after they test positive? How much immunity do people have after getting the disease? How much can children transmit the disease? Why are some susceptible to long COVID? All of these things are still uncertain. Science is slow. Neither public health officials nor journalists can wait for the research process to run its course. They have to communicate with the public immediately under conditions of uncertainty. So an emerging disease is created as an object of public knowledge before it really becomes an object of scientific knowledge. Closely related to this, and this is a third problem with the linear transmission model when you apply it to pandemics, is the fact that communication is central to the public health response, not something secondary. Thomas Abraham, a World Health Organization official, told us about the H1N1 pandemic. When a flu pandemic or any infectious disease outbreak, very often you won't have any other means of response except communication. Because if it's a new disease, there are probably no vaccines, there are no drugs, so all public health people can really do is communicate effectively. H1N1 was a big change from earlier epidemics where communication was seen as an adjunct. In that pandemic, Besser at the CDC spent an enormous amount of time on communication with journalists and other actors. The CDC has a large communication team that included both biomedical professionals and communication professionals trained in journalism and public relations. And I would say that this is an important manifestation of this centrality of communication is an important manifestation of mediatization. The fact that public health agencies have incorporated media logics and personnel trained in them into their own planning for pandemic response. And that media logics and biomedical logics are here combined in the public health response to a pandemic. Now, let me turn to H1N1. The H1 to COVID-19. The H1N1 pandemic is widely regarded, certainly in the US case, as a model of effective crisis communication. The current pandemic is obviously a very different story. In the case of the United States, the nation is deeply divided and suffering the worst toll from the pandemic worldwide. And it's a very, very complicated story about the response to the pandemic in many countries around the world. This pandemic would have been different from H1N1 under the best of circumstances. H1N1 was a success in part, obviously, because it turned out to be a mild virus. And it's worth adding that the success that officials enjoyed in controlling the narrative in the pandemic actually began to break down in the fall as the vaccine campaign got underway, because officials overpromised and the vaccination campaign went much more slowly than predicted. The current pandemic has such a deep impact on society that it would inevitably have been far more difficult to manage from a communication point of view. And certainly public officials could never have controlled the flow of information as they did in 2009. The current pandemic affects every aspect of society, and inevitably, many kinds of actors were going to be involved in forming and debating the response. In terms of journalism, the specialized health journalists could never have played the dominant role they did in the case of H1N1. Many kinds of journalists on many beats have been involved in the coverage of this crisis. Many elements of the media's role, it should be noted, are similar between the H1N1 pandemic and COVID. In the US and in most countries, from the evidence I have seen, the so-called mainstream media tended to defer to public health authorities. As with H1N1, the media hype theory, which is a kind of version of the mediatization argument, the idea that media sensationalize pandemics, and that media logics interfere with the transmission of scientific information, doesn't hold up. In a study of 37 countries, we found, looking at journalistic role performance, we found that the infotainment function of journalism, which involves sensationalizing and personalizing and so on, was actually lower in COVID coverage than it was in news in general. These are the indicators that we use to measure infotainment. So COVID coverage was more straight rather than more sensational than typical journalism. So this is one of the ways in which the role of the media is similar to its role in H1N1 in the absence of this kind of sensationalizing. But the most dramatic difference between this pandemic and H1N1 has to do with politicization. In the case of H1N1, political leaders stepped back and allowed public health officials to take the lead in addressing the public. They treated the public health response as something apart from everyday partisan politics. To some extent, a larger political role is inevitable in the case of COVID and is related to the broad impact of COVID. When it's necessary to shut down businesses and restrict people's movements, when a health crisis threatens people's livelihoods and the state must step in to provide support, inevitably political authorities must take a central role. And in our study of the 37 countries, we found that unlike the H1N1 pandemic, the most often cited sources in the news were political authorities, more than biomedical authorities and health professionals. So this is an aspect of politicization that I think is inevitable in a crisis as broad as this. In the United States, however, and in a number of other countries, often those with populist leadership, politicization took a deeper and more problematic form, resulting in sharp partisan divisions, mistrust of biomedical authorities, and enhanced spread of misinformation. And I want to focus on this aspect of it as I finish up here. In the United States, the CDC, which usually plays the central role in addressing the public, was marginalized early in the pandemic. Its role was replaced by the White House task force, whose press conferences Trump, of course, dominated, and which became, in effect, a substitute for the political rallies which Trump was unable to organize at the time. It's obviously part of Trump's mode of action that he must always have the spotlight. And as we have learned even more dramatically in more recent times, nothing can be apart from politics. Eventually, after Trump's much ridiculed comments about introducing bleach into the body to cure the virus, advisors persuaded Trump to discontinue the press conferences. And this meant essentially that there was no central effort to communicate with the public about public health measures. And Trump and his aides and his political allies in many parts of the country continued to undercut and attack public health officials and to fan partisan divisions over the public health response. The mainstream media in the US did not, for the most part, participate in this politicization, though it was, of course, a subject for news coverage. This is a story in my local newspaper about a protest against vaccine mandates. And by the way, our 37 countries shows that this was the case in most of the world, that the watchdog role of the media, which is their more political role in covering debate and doing investigation, was lower in COVID coverage than general news. And in general, the media, I would say, in the United States tried to follow the principle of putting the health crisis above politics and emphasizing solidarity among the population. But the role of the partisan media was very important in the US case, and again, I think in many other countries. Partisan media are, of course, a relatively new and deeply important development in the American media system. They grew with the rise of multi-channel media environment starting in the 1990s, and Fox News is obviously the most important component of this media ecosystem. And in the US case, these partisan media have a kind of a populist cultural appeal, which emphasizes hostility to cultural elites. And so the attack on public health professionals and defense of Trump in this case was something very natural to their appeal. And this, I think, was a fundamental factor in the development of public opinion and the public health response in the United States that very much hindered the ability of public health authorities to mount an effective response to the virus. Now, social media, of course, played an important role in spreading both misinformation and partisan narratives about the pandemic. And they represent a new form of mediatization, different from the old form centered around traditional news media. But I would argue that their role is actually not nearly important in the end as that of political leaders, Trump and others, and of partisan media, whether online or broadcast like Fox. Social media are everywhere in the world. And of course, there is misinformation about the pandemic on them everywhere. But they don't affect public opinion in Norway or Taiwan or New Zealand the way they do in the United States or Brazil, because there aren't powerful political and media elites promoting resistance to public health messages in those countries. But the result of this messaging, this partisan messaging, was a very sharp partisan difference in the response to the pandemic among different states and different people in the country. This is a graphic that shows the percent of people vaccinated in different states by politics, right? So the blue ones are the states in which Biden won the election, and the red ones are states in which Trump won the election. And the ones to the right-hand side of the graph are the ones with the highest vaccination rate. So you can see the strong partisan pattern in this response. And you can see it across everything: trust in biomedical authorities, mask wearing, and so on. So if you look at the response to the COVID pandemic across the world, it's clear that one of the main factors that determines a society's success is its degree of social solidarity, its ability to unite behind a social response. The countries with the highest number of deaths per capita are the US and Brazil, two countries with very similar populist leaders who build their political appeal precisely by cultivating political division, and applied that to the pandemic as to everything else. So moving toward a conclusion, I would say that the COVID crisis reminds us of the uncertainty of science and the complexity of health. And certainly these pose challenges for the media in representing the pandemic to the mass public, because clearly it is much too simplistic to say that they should simply transmit what science says. The COVID crisis also reminds us of the importance of consensus and social solidarity. One of the ways we judge a democratic political system is by its openness, its capacity for robust debate, and that's very important even in a public health emergency. Certainly, if we focus on the role of the media, I would not argue that the media should put aside their watchdog role during a public health crisis, because certainly there were many difficult issues which needed debate and many errors made by both public health officials and political authorities. And the decline in the watchdog role of media around the world, which we documented in our 37-nation study, is problematic. But another important criterion for judging the quality of a democratic system is its ability to come to enough consensus to take action on key problems society faces. This requires setting aside partisanship at certain times, and certainly requires an ability to accept the basic facts about the reality we face. This was certainly threatened in our country by the high level of polarization in our public life and the rise of populist leadership and populist partisan media. And I would say that the pandemic is a big warning call, but that the principle applies to a number of other threats that we face in the United States and other countries around the world, including those of racism and interethnic, intercommunal conflict, economic inequality, and also climate change, which is in many ways, I think, similar to the COVID pandemic, but on a much larger scale and a much larger time frame. Okay, and with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor. It was a wonderful, enriching talk. I was really fascinated to see a kind of like a deja vu moment, right? Like, I mean, you've done this study during the H1N1 time, the epidemic, and little did we know that we would be in a pandemic and living through all these things that you had already analyzed. For instance, when you had that image of the CDC, the Central Disease Control, giving out those health communication, that became so central during this entire pandemic, right? I mean, the way in which the control of the flow of information was happening or not happening. I mean, at least the role of the CDC, how do you see that as part of the larger picture in the way that the media feeds or the information is fed to the media through this important channel of information? How do you view that?
Yeah, so I think that the ideal is that the CDC will very, very actively provide this information to the media, and then the media will transmit it to the public. And as I say, this is an active process, so the media are not necessarily purely passive here. And in general, there's a lot of like exchange between the media and the CDC. Health journalists, for example, often over the years, they've participated in many exercises that public health officials organize for pandemic response, right? Where they have a kind of a scenario, they bring people together and they say, if we have this kind of a crisis, here's what we're going to do, right? So they've all kind of like practiced this together and they all know the real. So, and this is the ideal. And the ideal is that the public health professionals will also play this role that Besser did of speaking directly to the mass public. But what happened in the case of H1N1 in the of COVID in the United States, and it happened in many other countries as well, was that the politicians stepped in and cut this off. And they took the spotlight from themselves. They marginalized the CDC. And in many cases, they also, within Trump's task force, there were public health professionals. There was Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx, but they were more and more restricted from speaking directly to the mass public. Now, I should say that this picture is complicated in the US because the US, like India, is a federal system, right? And the process worked much more like it was supposed to in many of the states and local areas, right? Where you had the county public health officials in San Diego County holding their press conferences and the journalists working with them and so on. But this is obviously one of the things that in the US case really went wrong with the pandemic, is that this important role of the CDC, which is trained to do this task of communicating with the mass public and has studied it for a long time, it was marginalized in this crisis.
There's a question from Vasundhara Krishnan, and she asks, how would the issue of fake news, which is especially true for India, feature in this discourse of addressing health communication, especially during a pandemic situation? So this misinformation and fake news. So how would that fall into the ambit of this role of the mediatization of a pandemic?
Right. Well, as I was saying, this is a kind of a new form of mediatization, right? So the mediatization theory was based on the idea of, the whole theory developed in the broadcasting era, right? And so it's based on the idea of these very centralized mass media that dominate the flow of information. And today we have different kinds of mediatization, right? So we have a logic of professional journalism and mass media, but we also have this logic of social media, and it makes it much, much more complicated. But as I argued kind of briefly, I think I wouldn't exaggerate this too much, because I think that in the case of H1N1, social media were there just the same, but for the most part, you didn't have this big spread of misinformation, right? It was there, but most of the spread of information on social media was dominated by biomedical sources and mainstream media and so on. But one of the things, so in my view, the most important thing that fueled the spread of misinformation on social media was the role of leaders, right? Political leaders and also media leaders, like those in Fox, right? And because they were spreading this misinformation and undercutting the authority of both media and public health authorities, it was much easier for the misinformation to spread, much more difficult to, and much more difficult to undermine it. But it's an important part of how this process works.
And I think your next, your next book or your next project is connected to that, right? I mean, you're now working on this right now after the H1N1 research project. You're looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of mediatization, right? I think that's work in progress now for you.
Yes, I'm doing some work particularly, well, we're planning to do a second edition of the book, probably, with a chapter on COVID. And actually my co-author, Briggs, is planning to do a whole book that's a kind of an anthropology of COVID, interviewing people all around the country. I'm doing a study with colleagues in a number of other countries with populist governments. So we're looking at the United States, Brazil, Poland, and Serbia, and looking at all of the issues that are specific to countries with populist governments in COVID.
Okay, and how do you think it's going to be different or unique in populist countries?
Well, it's particularly in populist countries that you have this very strong effort by political leaders to undercut public health authorities, to present themselves as the ones who can save the people from the pandemic, and to politicize, because that's part of the logic of populism, is to politicize everything and to divide, to divide people. And that doesn't work very well in a pandemic. There are different responses in different populist countries. So in some populist countries like Brazil, for example, or the US, the leaders generally tried to minimize the pandemic and say it's not important. In other countries, they tried to use the pandemic to increase their political power, right? To crack down on opposition media. And so those are very different responses. And some countries, you have leaders that shift between them at different moments. But another thing about populism is that populism is generally skeptical of elites, and that so emphasizes like the common sense of ordinary people above elites, and elites there includes educated public health professionals like Dr. Anthony Fauci, right? So that's partly why so many public health officials have gotten death threats in countries like the United States or Brazil.
Yeah. Also, Professor, I wanted to ask you this question because you brought in this term called pharmaceutical marketing during your talk. And so I wanted to know, during this entire conversation through the media about the pandemic, how are healthcare professionals affected? Do you have any, body of research that suggests that it could have a negative impact on the doctors, the nurses, the entire healthcare community? Because of the way in which the pandemic is being discussed, because they're so critical in the system, right? I mean, they are the frontline workers. So how does it affect them, whether it is their morale or, how does it kind of involve them, the role of media, how is it touching the most critical sector, who is the healthcare sector?
Yes, so the frontline healthcare workers, I think it's a sort of a complicated story. So they were in most countries, I think, and certainly including the United States, they were big heroes through a lot of the pandemic. And they were covered a lot in the media, and the media really emphasized that we should support them and so on. I'm talking here about the mainstream media, particularly. But I also think that as the pandemic was politicized, and as there were political leaders, urging people, oh, don't wear masks, mask wearing became a kind of symbol of political identity and things like that. I mean, healthcare workers really felt that they were being undercut, and there were very grave problems of morale that resulted from that. And of course, they would see many patients who would come in and they would be told they had a diagnosis of COVID, and they would say, no, that's all bullshit. I know that this is just a conspiracy by the elites to hold us down. And, so obviously this was very frustrating for health workers. But, this is one of the ways in which it's complicated from the point of view of this theory of biomedicalization, right? That a pandemic does definitely increase the prestige of biomedicine. But in this case, that was partly undercut by the politicization that took place.
Sorry. And also this concept of, how we culturally interpret, understand, and seek to transform, health and lives, right? So like you're looking at these 36 countries, and each country may have a different way of interpreting culturally or communicating about it culturally. So how does that have implications in the study per se?
Well, that study is one that was never designed to study COVID, right? So it's just a general study of journalistic roles. And so there are very limited things that we can do with it. We can show how general journalistic roles that are kind of universal across cultures, how they COVID, but we can't really study the specific framing of COVID from that study. So I don't entirely know the answer to that. But it's also a quantitative study. It's not a more qualitative, interpretive kind of a study. But I'm sure that there are very interesting differences in the way that people think about the disease and their relationship to the disease. One of the most obvious big differences is between the countries where there's just much more individualism, right? And people think a lot about, well, I don't want my rights to be violated and so on. And the countries where people sort of think that it's natural that you have to act in a way that promotes the health of your neighbors and so on. I think that that's an important difference. But there are probably also much more complex differences about how people see health and illness, right? That in a more interpretive study, I mean, like the one that Briggs is doing, he's doing this study only in the United States, an ethnographic study of how people responded to the pandemic and how they gave it meaning. Okay, in a study like that, you would find a lot of differences among countries. And I think you would also find a lot of big differences within countries, right? Between people who live in rural areas and urban areas, and are upper class and lower class, and more educated and less educated. I mean, I study Latin America, and the experience of the pandemic is really different for people in different social classes. I mean, this is true in the US, but it's true everywhere, right? So there are lots of people who can't social distance because their working conditions and their living conditions don't permit that, right? And so, and this is one of the challenges of doing health communication, right? Is how are you going to communicate to this diversity of people with different, both cultural understandings and life situations? You can't send the same message to all of them.
So we have a question from Jacqueline Gomes, and her question is this: is the media being careful with the language regarding pandemic? For instance, sometimes they may suggest something when a certain conclusion is never drawn. For instance, when former President Trump touted the advantages of hydroxychloroquine as a way to prevent and treat COVID-19, he was dramatically overstating the results of an observational study. So her question is, therefore, does the media therefore choose to be very careful instead of concluding about certain vaccines working well or certain medicines doing well?
I would say that the media, I mean, again, you have to distinguish different kinds of media, but I'm talking about the mainstream media with professionalized journalism. They do try to be careful about that. And I think mostly they did a pretty good job during the pandemic. I mean, certainly on that case of the hydroxychloroquine. One of the problems that they do face, as I say, is that the science is very uncertain and there are often big differences. Like I mentioned, the role of the CDC. There was a lot of tension actually about within the CDC and between the CDC and other public health agencies about things like asymptomatic transmission. And I'm not sure the CDC got it right on that, at least at first. So it's a little complicated for the journalist. It's also somewhat uneven, though, in the news because, as I say, this story was so big that it wasn't covered only by the public, by the health journalists, right, who are specialized in that field. And I think that the care that's taken by like a local television news reporter is different from the care that's taken by a health reporter for, the New York Times. And so there's a kind of a spectrum of it. But mostly, I think they did a pretty good job of that. They tried.
Garima has a question, and her question is that you mentioned about social media in your talk. So can healthcare workers, can they collaborate with social media influencers to bring about better awareness instead of solely relying on the mainstream media narrative?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I should say that public health authorities definitely use social media too, right? And they have, like, one interesting thing that the Besser told us about the CDC is that they had special press conferences for bloggers to try and communicate with bloggers, and a lot of the bloggers are actually like specialists. But yeah, I think healthcare professionals themselves could try to use social media. Now, using social media is challenging, right? I mean, to get a large audience requires skill and sometimes resources, and sometimes there are logics of the way that the algorithms make it difficult to get the good messages out, right? I mean, often the bad messages are privileged by the algorithms. There's debate about this, but that's certainly true. But yeah, I think that it would actually make a lot of sense for even very kind of rank and file healthcare workers to try and band together and do their own initiatives from the bottom up in a way to affect pandemic communication. To some extent they did. There were definitely times when there would be like a social media post by a nurse or someone who was recounting some experience that would circulate very widely. And of course, mainstream media, they use social media for reporting, right? They use social media for one thing. It's like easy and cheap. It's easier than going out and interviewing people, especially during a pandemic. So they rely a lot on social media to find out what's going on in the world. And they would often recirculate some of these messages from healthcare professionals, yes.
Yeah. So, Professor, while we conclude this talk, we're almost running out of time. I just want you to leave us with some of your, final reflections, because, you very nicely kind of articulated this in perspective, put it in perspective for us, and showed how media systems can, show, connections or interconnectedness during a pandemic, and given the ecosystem that we all are in and how interconnected we all are, how important the role of media is in this entire was or is and continues to be during this pandemic. So any concluding thoughts that you would like to leave us with?
Well, one thing I would say here, I actually didn't focus a lot on media systems, and I didn't systematically compare countries, except a little bit with this 37 country study. But one thing I would say is that there is a big difference among media systems. And for one thing, the countries that have strong public service broadcasting, they generally had a lot less problem with misinformation and more effective public health responses, right? And this is a difference of media systems. So the countries where large parts of the population are relying on the public service broadcaster as their main source of information. They generally got very high quality of information. And it's not like the conspiracy theories and divisions and so on were absent there, but they were a lot less central than in the US. And so you don't see this kind of pattern of politicization and this unevenness in the unevenness in people's acceptance of the reality of the pandemic in those countries. So that's something that's related to media systems. Political systems, of course, matter a lot. But media systems do matter in that way, definitely. And just the general, so one thing that matters a lot in the comparative response is trust and credibility. So if people trust the institutions of their society, you're going to have a much more effective response. And so the countries where the institutions are seen as dishonest and partial and politicized, and there's suspicion of them, then it's much harder to get people to follow the recommendations.
Professor, we have one last question from Tanya, and that is, why is it important to be mindful about the amount and quality of news that we consume during a pandemic?
Well, as I showed the quote from Thomas Abraham, communication is the most important thing, especially before you even have treatments and vaccines. So to have an effective response, people have to understand what is the threat, and they have to understand the things that they have to do, and they have to understand the things that their government is going to have to do and support those things in order to have an effective response. And so communication and media, that's just absolutely central to the way that the mass public is going to behave and respond in a pandemic. And that's the most important thing that affects the spread of the disease.
Thank you, Professor. It was wonderful. This last 1 hour was so engaging and informative, and we would love to host you in IIM Bangalore sometime in person. We are doing this virtually, but we would like to host you sometime in IIM Bangalore.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah. Bye-bye.